The fog rolled in from the Sacramento River like a living thing, swallowing the lights of the marina one by one until only the distant glow of the Tower Bridge remained visible through the mist. Christina Hall pulled her jacket tighter as she walked down the wooden pier toward Slip 47, her footsteps echoing hollowly. October 9. The 26-year-old investigative journalist had covered dozens of stories of the water, but tonight felt different. The source who'd contacted her claimed to have evidence of a human trafficking operation using the marina as a staging point, complete with photographs and shipping manifests that would expose a network reaching into the highest levels of state government. Christina checked her watch again, 11:18 p.m. The meeting was supposed to happen at 11:30, but she'd arrived early to scope out the location and ensure she wasn't walking into a trap. The marina was nearly deserted, with only a few lights glowing from occupied house and the distant sound of music from a restaurant across the river. She'd been investigating corruption in California's Port Authority system for 3 months, following a tip about immigrant workers disappeared after arriving at various shipping facilities along the coast. Her editor at the Sacramento Herald had been skeptical, but Christina's instincts told her the story was bigger than anyone realized. The pier stretched 200 yards into the river, lined with slips containing everything from small fishing boats to expensive yachts. Slip 47 was near the end, occupied by a 30-foot cabin crew called Second Chance. The boat appeared empty, its windows dark, and no signs of activity on deck. Christina had brought her digital camera and tape recorder, though the technology was still clunky compared to what would become available just a few years later. She'd also left detailed notes about the meeting location with her roommate, along with copies of all her research files. At 11:25, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. A tall man in a dark jacket emerged from the fog, walking purposefully toward her position near the boats. "Ms. Hall," the man called softly. "Thank you for coming." Christina studied his face in the dim light from the pier's security lamps. He appeared to be in his 40s, with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent years working around boats, docks. "You're the one who called about the trafficking evidence?" "That's right, but we need to talk somewhere more private. Too many eyes and ears around here, even at night." The man gestured toward the cabin cruiser. "The boat's owner is a friend of mine. We can use his cabin to go through the documents safely." Christina felt her journalist instincts warring with base. The story could be the biggest break in her career, but something about the man's demeanor seemed. His nervousness appeared genuine, but there was an undercurrent of something, perhaps calculus. "Can't we talk here? I brought a recorder and the documents are on the boat, and there are photos. 5 minutes, all I need to show you what people are doing." Against her better judgment, Christina allowed herself to be led to the cabin cruiser. The man produced a key and unlocked the small cabin door, gesturing for her to enter first. The interior was cramped but comfortable, with a small table, bench seating, and navigation. As soon as she stepped inside, Christina realized her mistake. 2 other men were waiting in the shadow, and the helpful demeanor of her contact instant. "Ms. Hall, you've been asking the wrong questions to the wrong people." Stepping. He was well-dressed, older, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Who are you? What is this about?" "This is about your investigation into Port Authority contracts, about your inquiries into certain shipping matters and labor practice, about your complete failure to understand when you're in over your head." Christina backed toward the door, but the man who had led her onto the boat was already blocking her exit. Her hand moved instinctively toward her purse, where she kept a small can of peppers. "I'm a journalist. People know where I am to. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you if you're smart about," the well-dressed man interrupted. "We just need to have a conversation about your priority and your understanding of certain business relationships that are important to this region's economy." "You mean the human trafficking operation you're running through the port facility?" The man's expression. "Use. That's exactly the kind of inflammatory language that gets people into trouble. There are legitimate labor contractors who provide services to international shipping companies. What you call trafficking, others call economic opportunity." Christina realized she was facing something far more dangerous than simple corruption. These weren't petty criminals. They were part of an organized operation with the confidence to confront a journalist directly. "Let me leave, and we can pretend this never happened," trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm afraid it's too late for you. You've already made inquiries that have attracted attention from people who don't appreciate publicity. Now we need to determine how much damage you've already done and how to prevent further problems." The fog had thickened around the marina, muffling sounds, creating an isolated pocket of darkness. Christina's mind raced through her options, but with 3 men blocking the exit and no way to signal for help, she was completely at their mercy. "What do you want from me?" "First, we want to know exactly what evidence you think you've gathered and who you've shared it with. Then we'll discuss your future career plan and how they might be adjusted to avoid conflict with certain businesses." Christina thought about the files in her apartment, the interviews she'd recorded, and the shipping manifest she'd photographed. If these people were willing to confront her directly, they were probably prepared to eliminate any evidence that threatened their operation. "And if I don't cooperate?" The well-dressed man smiled, but it never reached. "Let's not discuss unpleasant. I'm sure we can reach an understanding with everyone." As the cabin cruiser's engine started and the boat began moving away from the dock, Christina realized that her investigation into human trafficking had made her a target of the very criminal she'd been trying to expose. The fog closed around the headed, carrying her away and toward an uncertain. The last thing she lights fading into the mist, along with any hope of rescue. The nightmare stumbled in. Detective Michael Santos stared at the missing person's desk, trying to shake off the fatigue from a sleepless night spent working a double homicide. Christina Hall, age 26, investigative journalist, reported missing by her roommate. He failed to return home from a late-night meeting. Another runaway reporter, his partner, Detective Janet Rodriguez, as she reviewed the preliminary information, probably got too close to a story and decided to skip town until things cooled down. Santos wasn't convinced. He'd worked missing persons cases for 8 years and had developed instincts about which disappearances represented genuine danger. Something about Christina Hall's felt wrong from the beginning. The roommate, Lisa Chen, had provided a detailed timeline of Christina's activity leading up to her disappearance. The journalist had been working on a story about corruption in California's port system, focusing specifically on labor practices and shipping manifests that didn't match official records. She was obsessed with this port authority story, Chen explained during the initial interview, working 14-hour days, making calls to sources, cross-referencing shipping records with immigration documents. She said she was close to breaking something big. Santos made notes as Chen described Christina's investigation and the evidence she'd been gathering. The reporter had been systematic, thorough, creating files for each shipping company and maintaining detailed logs of her interviews and documents. Did she mention feeling threatened or being warned off the story? Not directly, but she'd been more cautious, checking her car for tracking devices, varying her routes home, that kind of thing. She said investigative journalism always involved. The marina where Christina had planned to meet her source was a sprawling complex along the Sacramento River with hundreds of boats and multiple access points. Santos and Rodriguez arrived at Riverside Marina at 9:15 a.m., noting the layout and security arrangement. No surveillance cameras covering the pier areas, Rodriguez, and the security guard works alone for 12-hour shifts. Easy place to make someone disappear. Harold Voss, the night security guard, remembered seeing a woman matching Christina's description walking toward the far end of the pier around 11:20 p.m. He'd been making his round and hadn't paid close attention, assuming she was meeting someone at one of the boats. "Did you see her leave?" "Can't say for sure. I was dealing with some teenagers drinking beer near the boat launch around midnight. By the time I got back to that section of the marina, it was quiet." Santos examined the pier carefully, looking for any signs of struggle or evidence of what had happened. The wooden planks showed scuff marks that could have been from anything, and the river's current would have carried away any items that might have fallen into the water. Christina's Honda Accord was still parked in the marina's lot. keys locked inside, and no signs of forced entry. Her purse was on the passenger, containing her wallet, press credentials, and a small tape recorder that appeared to have been used recently. Someone called her away from the car, Rodriguez concluded. Either she went willingly, was forced to leave everything behind. Back at the police station, Santos began the process of tracking Christina's recent activities and identifying the sources she'd been working with. Her editor at the Sacramento Herald, Tom Morrison, provided copies of her research files and a list of people she'd interviewed for the Port Authority story. Christina was convinced she'd uncovered something major, Morrison explained: human trafficking, document fraud, corruption involving state officials, but she was still gathering evidence and hadn't written anything definitive yet. Did she mention receiving threats? Not specific threats, but she'd been careful about her security. She'd learned that asking questions about port operations tends to attract attention from people who prefer privacy. Santos reviewed Christina's phone record, looking for patterns in her communications leading up to the disappearance. Most of her calls to legitimate sources, port workers, immigration lawyers, shipping company employees, but several calls in the past week had been to unlisted numbers that would require subpoenas to trace. The investigation's first major lead came from Christina's research file. She'd been tracking shipping manifests for a company called Pacific Coast Logistics, noting discrepancies between official crew lists and the actual number of workers seen at various facilities. Look at this, showing Rodriguez a series of photocopied documents, manifests showing 15 crew members, but witness interviews suggesting 25 to 30 people were offloaded at the port. Or, where are the extra workers going? That's what Christina was trying to figure out, and someone didn't want her to find the answer. The case took on greater urgency when Santos discovered that Christina wasn't the first journalist to investigate Pacific Coast Logistics. Two other reporters had covered similar stories in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and both had abandoned their investigations after experiencing what they described as intimidation and harassment. We need to treat this as a potential kidnapping, Supervisor Walsh. This isn't a missing person who left voluntarily. Someone took her to stop her investigation. Walsh authorized additional resources the case, including surveillance teams to monitor known associates, Pacific Coast Logistics, and wiretap key phone numbers identified in Christina's. But as Santos dug deeper into the shipping company's operations, he encountered resistance from unexpected sources. Information requests were delayed, witnesses became unavailable, and several of Christina's sources suddenly refused to speak with police. Someone's shutting down our investigation, Rodriguez, after their third potential witness declined to be interviewed. These people are scared of something more than just bad publicity. Santos realized they were dealing with an organization sophisticated to interfere with a police investigation. The disappearance of Christina Hall was just the beginning of a case that would reveal corruption reaching far beyond the Sacramento waterfront. As the first week of the investigation concluded with no solid leads, mounting evidence of systematic obstruction, Santos made a decision that would define the next several years of his career. He was going to find Christina Hall, no matter how long it took or how many powerful people tried to stop him. The evidence board in Conference Room B had grown into a sprawling web of photographs, shipping manifests, phone records, and witness statements that painted a picture of systematic obstruction. Detective Santos stood before the display, trying to make sense of connections that seemed to shift. He thought he identified a pattern. Pacific Coast Logistics is a subsidiary of International Maritime Services, which is owned by a holding company called West Coast Venture, explained to Lieutenant Walsh during their weekly briefing. Every time we try to trace ownership or interview executives, we hit another layer of corporate structure. 3 weeks of investigation had yielded frustrating. Christina Hall remained missing. Her sources stopped cooperating with police, and several key witnesses had suddenly left Sacramento for extended vacation or family emergency. Detective Rodriguez entered the conference folder. I've got the financial records for Pacific Coast Logistics and their interest. Large cash deposits that don't correspond to legitimate shipping revenue, payments to dozens of shell companies, and regular transfers to offshore accounts. Money laundering. Has to be. But laundering money from what? The shipping business doesn't generate this kind of cash flow, especially not from the relatively small operations they're running through Sacramento. Santos studied the financial patterns Rodriguez had identified. The numbers suggested an operation far more complex than simple corruption or document fraud. Someone was using the shipping company as a front for activities that generated millions of dollars in untraceable income. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Gonzalez, a cleaning woman who worked at the Pacific Coast Logistics office, contacted police after seeing Christina's photograph in the newspaper. I saw that woman at the office about a month ago, Gonzalez Santos, during a carefully arranged meeting at a coffee shop far from the shipping company's headquarters. She was asking questions about the workers who come in on the boats at night. What kind of workers? People who don't speak English, who look scared, who get taken away in vans before anyone official sees them. The company tells us not to pay attention, but you notice things when you're cleaning. Gonzalez described a pattern of late-night arrivals at the shipping facility, with groups of immigrants being processed through the warehouse and transported to unknown locations. The official manifests never reflected these additional passengers, and employees were explicitly instructed not to discuss what they observed. Did Ms. Hall speak with any of the workers? She tried, but they were too frightened to talk. Someone always watching, always making sure nobody says too much. But she took pictures with a small camera. Santos felt the first surge of real progress in weeks. If Christina had photographic evidence of the trafficking operation, those images might have been worth killing for. Do you know what happened to her after she visited the office? Gonzalez shook her head, nervous. But the next day, Mr. Chen, he's one of the supervisors, he told all the cleaning staff that we might start seeing police around, and that we should remember that talking to cops could be dangerous for people whose immigration status isn't completely legal. The threat was clear and effective. Most of the facility's workforce consisted of immigrants who couldn't afford to attract government attention, making them perfect for maintaining silence about activities they'd witnessed. Santos arranged for Gonzalez to receive witness protection, but the investigation still faced systematic resistance. Phone records requests were delayed by court challenge. Surveillance teams reported that suspected facilities had been suddenly abandoned, and several key shipping manifests disappeared from Port Authority. Someone with serious juice is running interference. Frustrating. This isn't just corporate lawyers protecting a client. We're dealing with people who have influence in the courts, the Port Authority, and possibly other law enforcement. The corruption became more apparent when Santos attempted to expand the investigation to include federal agencies. Immigration and Customs, and it showed little interest pursuing the trafficking allegation, and the FBI claimed they were already monitoring the situation as part of an ongoing investigation that took precedent over Lucerne. They're telling us to back off, particularly unproductive meeting with federal agents. Whatever Pacific Coast Logistics is involved in, somebody wants it handled at a higher level. Santos refused to be deterred. If federal agencies weren't going to pursue Christina's disappearance aggressively, he would continue the investigation using local resources and unconventional methods. Working with contacts in the media, Santos arranged for renewed publicity about Christina's case, hoping to pressure witnesses into coming forward or to flush out additional information from her sources. The strategy yielded mixed results. More people called with tips, but most led nowhere, and the increased attention seemed to make potential witnesses even more reluctant to cooperate. The case took a darker turn when Maria Gonzalez was attacked outside her apartment on November 20th. She survived, but the message was clear. People who cooperated with the police investigation would face consequences. This is organized crime territory now, Walsh concluded, after reviewing the assault report. We're not just looking for a missing journalist anymore. "We're investigating an operation that's willing to use violence to protect its interests." Santos visited Gonzalez in the hospital where she was recovering from a broken arm and multiple bruises. Despite her injuries, she was more determined than ever to help find Christina. "They think they can scare us into silence," Gonzalez said, her voice weak but resolute. "But that girl was trying to help people like us. We have to do whatever we can to find her." As November turned into December, Santos realized that Christina Hall's disappearance was just one element of a much larger criminal enterprise. The shipping company was a front, the trafficking operation was generating enormous profits, and the network had enough political and law enforcement connections to interfere with official investigation. But somewhere in that maze of corruption and violence, Christina was either being held prisoner or her body was hidden in a location that would reveal the full scope of the crimes being committed. Santos was determined to follow the evidence wherever it led, even if it meant challenging the very institutions he'd sworn to serve. The investigation had evolved from a missing person case into a battle against organized crime, and Santos was beginning to understand that finding Christina would require tactics and resources far beyond conventional police work. Special Agent Elena Vasquez reviewed the Christina Hall case file with growing concern, noting the pattern of obstruction and witness intimidation that had characterized the local investigation. The file had been forwarded to federal attention after Detective Santos requested assistance dealing with what he suspected was interstate organized crime activity. The trafficking operation is using shipping routes between California, Oregon, and Washington, Santos explained during his briefing to the federal task force. "We've identified at least 12 facilities where immigrants are processed outside official channels, and the money trail suggests coordination between multiple criminal organizations." Vasquez had 20 years of experience investigating human trafficking and organized crime. The case Santos described matched patterns she'd seen in other major cities where legitimate shipping companies provided cover for smuggling operations that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. What about the missing journalist? Any leads on her location? Christina Hall has been missing for 116 days. "We believe she's either dead or being held at a secure location while the organization determines how to handle the exposure she represents." Ortiz, Agent Rodriguez, no relation to Detective Rodriguez, consulted the intelligence files that had been compiled about Pacific Coast Logistics and its affiliated companies. "We've been tracking this network for 2 years, but we haven't been able to place undercover assets close enough to gather actionable intelligence." The federal investigation revealed the scope of corruption that had hampered Santos's local effort. The trafficking network included compromised officials in the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the Coast Guard, and several port authorities along the West Coast. Information about police investigations was routinely leaked to criminal organizations, allowing them to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts. "We need to treat this as a penetration operation," Vasquez announced. "Assume that standard law enforcement channels are compromised and develop intelligence through alternative methods." The task force established a secure facility away from federal buildings and local police stations, using encrypted communication, carefully vetted personnel. Their investigation would run parallel to Santos' local, with minimal information sharing until they could identify and eliminate security leak. Agent Chen, assigned to coordinate local law enforcement, worked directly with Santos and Detective Rodriguez, providing federal resources while maintaining operation security. The collaboration was delicate. Santos needed federal assistance, but the task force couldn't risk exposing their broader investment. "We've identified the leadership structure," Chen secure briefing in March. "The trafficking network is controlled by a council of 5 individuals representing different aspects of the operation: shipping, labor, political protection, money laundering, and enforcement." Santos studied the organizational chart the federal agents had constructed. "Any of these people connected to Christina's disappearance?" Victor Kasabian handles enforcement and security for the network. He's responsible for eliminating threats to the operation, including journalists, law enforcement officers, and potential witnesses. The name meant nothing to Santos, but Agent Vasquez provided a disturbing background briefing. Kasabian was a former military contractor with connections to organized crime families in Los Angeles and Las Vegas. His methods included kidnapping, torture, and murder, with at least 8 suspected victims over the past decade. If Kasabian was assigned to handle the Christina Hall problem, she's either dead or being held at one of his secure facilities, concluded grimly. The task force had identified 3 persons connected to Kasabian's operation: a warehouse in Stockton, a ranch in Sierra Nevada foothills, and a boat maintenance facility in Sacramento River Delta. All were heavily guarded and inaccessible to conventional surveillance. We need someone inside the organization, Chen. The only way to locate Christina and gather evidence against the trafficking network is through an undercover operation. Agent Tony Restrepo volunteered for the assignment. With a background in organized crime investigations and fluent Spanish, he could pose as a corrupt port official willing to facilitate shipping operations for the right price. The undercover operation began in April 1994, with Restrepo establishing contact with mid-level figures in the trafficking network. His progress was slow and dangerous. Gaining trust required participating in illegal activities, and any mistake could result in his death. "They're testing me constantly," Restrepo reported during a secure communication session. "Small jobs at first, helping to falsify manifests and coordinate transportation. But they're watching everything I do. One wrong move will blow the entire operation." Meanwhile, Santos continued his investigation through conventional means, following financial records and interviewing witnesses, while the federal task force pursued their covert approach. The parallel investigations occasionally conflicted, but both teams recognized that finding Christina required multiple strategies. The breakthrough came when Restrepo was invited to participate in a special project involving the disposal of someone who had caused problems for business operations. The assignment was a test of his loyalty, but it also represented an opportunity to gather intelligence about how the organization eliminated threats. "They want me to help with cleanup operations at the Delta facility," Restrepo. "Something about making sure a problem doesn't resurface future." Vasquez realized they might be about to discover fate. If she was dead, her body might be facility Restrepo was being sent to clean up. If she was alive, the operation might represent execution. "We need to be ready to move on multiple locations simultaneously." Vasquez. "If Restrepo's cover gets blown, we'll have one chance to recover him, and any evidence before the organization destroys everything." As spring turned to summer, the investigation had evolved into a complex operation involving multiple agencies, undercover assets, and the constant threat that Christina Hall was running out of time. Somewhere in the network of criminal facilities and safe houses, a journalist was either suffering in captivity or already dead, because she'd tried to expose the truth about human trafficking. The task force was preparing for a coordinated strike that would either rescue Christina or recover her body, while simultaneously taking down one of the largest human trafficking operations on the West Coast. Agent Tony Restrepo adjusted the hidden microphone sewn into his jacket collar as he followed Victor Kasabian down a narrow dirt road toward the boat maintenance facility. 3 months of undercover work had finally earned him access to the trafficking network's inner operation, but he was about to learn the cost of that access. "This is where we handle special problems," Kasabian explained, gesturing toward a cluster of concrete buildings surrounded by high fences and motion sensors. "People who ask too many questions, law enforcement getting too close, journalists who think they're crusaders of justice." The facility appeared to be a legitimate boat repair operation, with several vessels in various stages of maintenance and workers performing routine tasks. But Restrepo noticed details that suggested a more sinister purpose: reinforced buildings with no windows, security cameras monitoring every angle, and armed guards positioned throughout the complex. "How many special problems you handled," Restrepo, trying to sound casual, intelligent, "over the past 5 years? 24. Depends on how you count problems that solve themselves versus problems that require direct intervention." Kasabian led him to a concrete building in the back of the complex, using a key card to access a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The interior was divided into several rooms, including what appeared to be holding cells and an interrogation area equipped with restraints and surveillance equipment. "This is where we evaluate threats to determine the appropriate response," Kasabian continued. "Sometimes people can be reasoned with, convinced to see the situation from a different perspective. Other times, permanent solutions are necessary." Restrepo felt his heart rate increase as he realized he was touring a facility designed for kidnapping, torture, and murder. The federal task force had theorized about such locations, but seeing the infrastructure of systematic violence was deeply disturbing. "What about that journalist who was asking questions about the shipping manifest?" Kasabian's expression darkened. "Christina Hall. She was a stubborn one, refused to understand that some stories are too dangerous to tell. We tried education, persuasion, various forms of pressure, but she remained uncooperative." "Is she still here?" In a manner of speaking, her case became a teaching example for other potential problems. When people ask too many questions about our operations, we explain what happened to the last journalist who got too curious. Restrepo struggled to maintain his cover while processing the implication that Christina had been murdered, but Kasabian wasn't finished with his. "Would you like to see where we keep current problems while decisions are being made about their—" They walked to another section of the building where Kasabian used a second key card to access a corridor lined with reinforced doors. Through small windows, Restrepo could see that several cells were occupied by people who appeared to be immigrants in various states of stress. These are workers who become uncooperative or who've been exposed to too much information about Kasabian. Some will be relocated to different, others will be permanent. In the last cell, Restrepo, a woman who Christina Hall description from the missing person, she was alive, appeared severely malnourished and showed signs of prolonged activity. When she looked up at the window, her eyes held a mixture of hope and desperation. "That's the Hall woman," Kasabian said, noticing Restrepo's interest. "We've been using her as a research subject to refine our persuasion techniques. 9 months of various approaches, and she's still insisting she can expose our entire operation." Restrepo realized that Christina had been held captive for the entire duration of the investigation, enduring torture and psychological abuse while remaining defiant. Her survival was remarkable, but it also meant she possessed detailed knowledge about the trafficking network. "What's the plan for?" "That depends on how quickly we can wrap up current and relocate to new facility. If we're moving within the next month, she comes with us for continued research. If the timeline extends longer, permanent disposal becomes the more practical option." As they concluded the tour, Kasabian outlined Restrepo's assignment: help coordinate the transfer of problematic assets to disposal site while ensuring that no evidence remained to connect the network to their previous activities. "Tomorrow night, we're moving several assets to permanent resolution. Your job is to help with transportation and site preparation. Consider it your final test before full membership in our organization." Restrepo maintained his cover long enough to complete the facility tour and agreed to participate in the disposal operation. But as soon as he was alone, he activated his emergency communication to alert the federal task force. "Christina Hall is alive, but in immediate danger," he reported during a secure transmission that evening. "The organization is planning to eliminate multiple prisoners tomorrow night, including her. We need to move immediately." Agent Vasquez coordinated the emergency response from the task's command center. "We're moving all assets into position for a simultaneous strike on 3 facilities. Local SWAT teams are standing by, and we've got federal agents ready to move on the Delta location." Detective Santos joined the federal operation after months of frustration with the local investigation. His knowledge of the case and determination to find Christina made him a valuable addition to the rescue team. "After 9 months, we finally know where she is," Santos said as he checked his equipment for the raid. "But we've got maybe 12 hours before they kill her and eliminate all the evidence." Stakes couldn't have. The trafficking network was preparing to abandon their California operation and relocate to new territories, which meant eliminating witnesses and destroying evidence that could connect them to years of criminal activity. Christina Hall's survival had provided the trafficking network with valuable intelligence about law enforcement investigation methods, but it had also given federal agents the break they needed to locate and infiltrate the organization. As darkness fell over the Sacramento River Delta, federal agents and local police prepared for an operation that would either rescue a brave journalist or recover her body from the people who'd held her captive for 9 months. The investigation that had begun with Christina's disappearance was about to reach a climax, with her life hanging in the balance and the future of a major trafficking network at stake. The assault teams moved through the pre-dawn darkness shadows, their night vision equipment turning the industrial complex into a green-tinged maze of buildings and obstacles. Agent Vasquez coordinated the operation from a command vehicle positioned half a mile from the target, while Detective Santos prepared to breach the building where Christina Hall was being held. "All teams in position," whispered Agent Chen through the tactical radio network. "Thermal imaging shows approximately 15 people inside the main complex, with at least 6 in the detention area." The plan called for simultaneous entry through 4 access points, overwhelming the facility's defenses before guards could eliminate prisoners or destroy evidence. Agent Restrepo remained undercover inside the complex, ready to guide rescue teams to Christina's location while maintaining his cover as long as possible. "Team Alpha, move in 30 seconds, Vasquez commanded. "Remember, we have confirmed hostages in the detention area. Treat this a rescue operation with extreme prejudice for anyone who threatens prisoner safety." Santos checked his equipment one final time, focusing on the bolt cutters that would be needed to breach the reinforced detention. After 9 months, Christina Hall was finally within reach, but the next few minutes determined whether she... At precisely 2:35 a.m., the assault began with coordinated explosion that took out the facility's communications equipment and backup generator. Emergency lighting activated throughout the complex, casting eerie shadows as federal agents poured through breached doors and windows. "Federal agents! Nobody move!" echoed through the building, attacked security area methodically. The facility's guards had been caught completely off guard, with most surrendering immediately when faced with overwhelming force. Santos followed Team Bravo towards the detention area, where Restrepo was waiting with key cards and detailed knowledge of the building's layout. "Christina's in cell 7, but there are 5 other prisoners in that corridor. Kasabian was planning to execute all of them tonight. The corridor containing the detention cells was secured within minutes, but accessing the individual cells required careful coordination. Each door was reinforced and equipped with electronic locks that could only be opened from a central control station. "I've got the control panel," Agent Martinez reported from the facility security office. "All cell doors are unlocked, but some of the prisoners appear to be unconscious or drugged." Santos reached cell 7 first, pulling open the heavy door to find Christina huddled in the corner of the small space. She was conscious but clearly weakened by months of captivity, her eyes reflecting the disorientation of someone who'd given up hope of rescue. "Christina, I'm Detective Santos with the Sacramento Police. You're safe now. We're here to get you out." She stared at him as if unable to process that her ordeal was ending. Santos knelt beside her, checking for obvious injuries while speaking in calm, reassuring tones. "Can you walk? We need to get you to medical attention." Christina nodded weakly, allowing Santos to help her to her feet. She appeared to have lost significant weight and showed signs of prolonged physical and psychological abuse. But she was "The files," her voice barely audible. "I hid files before they took me. Evidence about the trafficking op. We'll get the files later. Right now, We need to focus on getting you medical treatment." As rescue teams evacuated the prisoners, other agents secured the facility's records and computer systems. The intelligence gathered during the raid would provide evidence for prosecuting entire trafficking network, but the immediate priority was ensuring the survival of people who'd been held captive for months. The raid's most dramatic moment came when Victor Kasabian attempted to escape through a concealed tunnel that connected the detention facility to the boat dock. Agent Chen intercepted him as he emerged near the water, leading to a brief firefight that ended with Kasabian's capture. "Victor Kasabian, you're under arrest for kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy to commit murder," Chen announced as federal agents handcuffed the enforcement chief who'd overseen Christina's torture. Kasabian remained silent during his arrest, but his capture represented a major breakthrough in the investigation. As the network's enforcement specialist, he possessed detailed knowledge about the organization's structure, methods, and locations of other facilities. By 4:00 a.m., the raid was complete. 6 prisoners had been rescued, including Christina, and 5 immigrants who'd been scheduled for 15 members of the trafficking network were in custody, along with computers, financial records, and communications equipment that would provide evidence for prosecuting a broader conspiracy. Christina was transported to UC Davis Medical Center, where doctors began treating her for malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological trauma. Her physical condition was serious but not life-threatening, and her mental state appeared remarkably resilient given the duration and severity of her captivity. "She's been through hell, but she's a fighter," Dr. Patricia Wong during the initial medical evaluation. "With proper treatment and time, she should make a full recovery." The other rescued prisoner in worse condition, having been held longer and subjected to more severe abuse. 2 required immediate surgery, and all showed signs of systematic torture designed to break their resistance and extract information. As dawn broke over the Sacramento River Delta, the facility that had served as a center for human trafficking and murder was transformed into a federal crime scene. Evidence teams would spend weeks documenting the systematic violence that had been conducted there, while prosecutors prepared cases against the network's leadership. Detective Santos sat in the hospital waiting room, reflecting on the investigation that had consumed 9 months of his career. Christina Hall was alive and safe, but the experience had changed both of them in ways that would take time to understand. The rescue was successful, but it was also the beginning of a new phase in the investigation. With Kasabian and other key figures in custody, federal agents would have opportunities to gather intelligence about the trafficking network's broader operation and identify additional victims who needed rescue. Most importantly, Christina's survival meant that someone who'd witnessed the organization's crimes firsthand would be available to testify about the systematic abuse and murder that had been conducted under the cover of legitimate shipping. Victor Kasabian sat across from the federal prosecution team in an orange jumpsuit, his confidence from the boat facility replaced by the grim realization that his criminal empire was collapsing. 4 days of interrogation had yielded minimal cooperation, but the evidence seized during the raids was building an airtight case against him and his associate. "Mr. Kasabian, you're facing life without parole on the kidnapping charges alone," Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Walsh announced. "Spreading case add human trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder, and you're looking at multiple life sentences." Kasabian's attorney, Robert Chen, had been trying to negotiate a plea agreement since his client's arrest. "My client is prepared to discuss cooperation in exchange for consideration regarding sentencing guidelines." Agent Vasquez leaned forward. "What we want is simple: the complete structure of the trafficking network, the locations of other facilities, and detailed information about every crime your organization has committed over the past 5 years." For the first time since his arrest, Kasabian showed signs of wavering. The federal case was overwhelming, with surveillance recordings from Agent Restrepo's undercover work, financial evidence tracing money laundering operation, and testimony from rescued prisoners who could identify him as their captor. I need guarantees about protective custody. People I'd be testifying against don't leave loose ends. If I cooperate, I'm a dead man without federal protection. Walsh consulted with Agent Vasquez before responding. We can discuss witness protection, but only after you provide substantial cooperation. Start with Christina Hall. Tell us exactly what happened from the night she was taken. Kasabian was quiet for several minutes, calculating his options. When he began speaking, his voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a business transaction rather than kidnapping and torture. The Hall situation started in early October, when our sources at Pacific Coast Logistics reported that a journalist was asking questions about shipping manifests and worker transportation. She'd been interviewing employees and cross-referencing official records with observed activity. Detective Santos, observing from behind one-way glass, made detailed notes. Kasabian described the systematic surveillance that had preceded Christina's kidnapping. We initially tried indirect pressure, anonymous phone calls suggesting she focus on other stories, having her followed to make her nervous, arranging for some of her sources to become unavailable. But Hall was persistent. When did you decide to take direct action? When she contacted someone claiming to have evidence about the trafficking of one of our people intercepted the communication and arranged to pose as the source, setting up the meeting at Riverside Marina. Walsh leaned forward. Walk us through exactly. Kasabian consulted with his attorney before continuing. I was on the boat with 2 associates when Hall arrived at Marina. The plan was to bring her aboard for questions, determine how much she knew, and decide whether she could be convinced to abandon, but suspicious. Almost immediately, she didn't want to board the boat, kept asking about the evidence we'd promised to show her. When we insisted she come aboard to see the document, she tried to leave. Santos felt sick. Kasabian described the moment Christina realized she'd walked into a trap. The journalist's instincts had been correct, but not strong enough to save her. The people who'd been monitoring her investigation. We couldn't let her leave, knowing about the meeting location and the boat we'd used. She fought hard, screaming and trying to get away, but we managed to subdue her and take her to the Delta facility. How long was she held there? 9 months and 18 days. We kept her in one of the detentions while we evaluated the threat she represented and attempted to gain her cooperation. Agent Vasquez interrupted. You mean while you tortured her for information? Kasabian's expression remained neutral. We applied various forms of pressure to encourage cooperation. Sleep deprivation, isolation, irregular feeding, temperature manipulation, psychological techniques designed to break down resistance. And when those we escalated to physical coercion. Hall was remarkably stubborn, insisted she could expose our interrogation, claimed she'd hidden evidence that would be discovered if anything happened to her. Walsh her note. Did she ever provide the information you were seeking? She gave us details about her research methods and confirmed that she hadn't shared her complete findings with editors or law enforcement, but she refused to reveal where she'd hidden her evidence or identify other sources who might have information about our operation. Santos realized that Christina's survival had depended on her captor's uncertainty about what evidence she'd gathered and who else might know about the trafficking network. Her refusal to provide complete cooperation had kept her alive for 9 months. When did you decide to eliminate her? The decision was made in early July when federal agents started asking questions about our operation. We realized her disappearance had attracted more attention than we'd anticipated. Keeping her alive was becoming too risky. But you delayed the execution? Kasabian nodded. I wanted to conduct one final interrogation to determine whether she'd created any kind of insurance policy. If she'd prepared evidence to be released posthumous, we needed to know what it contained. The confession continued for hours, with Kasabian providing details about the trafficking network's structure, methods, and connections to legitimate businesses and government officials. His cooperation was motivated by self-preservation rather than remorse, but it provided prosecutors with comprehensive evidence for dismantling the entire organization. How many people has your organization killed over the past 5 years? Vasquez asked directly. Kasabian was quiet for a long moment. approximately 35 individuals who posed threats to our operation: journalists, law enforcement officers, potential witnesses, workers who became uncooperative. The number was staggering, representing a systematic campaign of murder designed to protect a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Christina Hall's survival made her one of the few people who testify about the organization's method and provide evidence for prosecuting its leadership. As the interrogation concluded, Kasabian had provided enough information to justify federal witness protection in exchange for his testimony against other members of the trafficking network. His cooperation would lead to additional arrests and the closure of facilities in multiple states. But for Detective Santos, the most important revelation was that Christina's determination to expose the truth had nearly cost her life, while also providing the evidence needed to bring down one of the largest human trafficking operations on the West Coast. The war room had been transformed into a comprehensive intelligence with organizational charts covering every wall and evidence files stacked on tables throughout the Agent Vasquez stood before the assembled task force, outlining the scope of the criminal network that Kasabian's cooperation had revealed. We're looking at a 5-state operation involving human trafficking, money laundering, political corruption, and systematic murder. Kasabian's information has identified 47 facilities, over 200 individuals involved in various capacities, and financial assets worth approximately $400 million. Detective Santos studied the organization chart that showed the trafficking network's command. At the top was a council of 7 individuals who controlled different aspects of the operation: shipping and logistics, labor placement, political protection, money laundering, enforcement, international connection, and overall coordination. The council operates like a corporate board, Agent explained, with each member responsible for specific territories and functions. They meet monthly to coordinate operations and resolve conflicts between different components of the network. Christina Hall's investigation had inadvertently threatened the network's California operation, which served as a major entry point for immigrants being trafficked from Asia and Latin America. The shipping facilities, Sacramento, Oakland, and Los Angeles, processed thousands of workers annually, generating enormous profit, forced labor, and debt bonding. Christina uncovered about 10% of their actual operation, reviewing financial records that showed the scope of the money laundering activity. If she'd been allowed to continue her investigation, she might have exposed the task force had used Kasabian's information to coordinate with law enforcement agents in Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and Arizona, planning simultaneous raid facility in the region. The operation would be the largest anti-trafficking action in federal history, requiring careful coordination to prevent evidence destruction and witness. Agent Rodriguez briefed the team on political corruption that had enabled the network to operate impunity. We've identified compromised officials in immigration, port authority, labor department, and law enforcement agents. Some were paid directly, others were blackmailed, coerced into cooperation. The corruption reached deeper than anyone had suspected. A deputy director of the Immigration and Naturalization Service had provided advance warning about enforcement action, allowing the network to relocate operations and avoid detection. Several Port Authority officials had falsified inspection records, cargo manifest, enabling the trafficking organization to process workers without official scrutiny. How did they maintain operational security for such a large network? Compartmentalization and systematic elimination of threats, Vasquez replied. Most participants only knew about their specific roles, and anyone who learned too much about the broader operation was either recruited into leadership or eliminated. Christina's case had followed this pattern perfectly. Her investigation had made her a threat that required elimination, but her survival had provided federal agents with unprecedented insight into the network's methods and vulnerabilities. The medical evaluation of rescued prisoners had revealed the systematic abuse used to maintain control over trafficked workers. Debt bondage was enforced through violence and threats against family members, while isolation and language barriers prevented victims from seeking help from law enforcement. The psychological control was as sophisticated as the financial one. Dr. Sarah Wong reported the task. Victims were convinced cooperation with authorities resulted in deportation, imprisonment, or harm to their family. Christina's psychological resilience had been remarkable under the circumstances. 9 months' captivity and torture had left her traumatic stress, other psychological injury, but her core personality remained. Importantly, her memory of events and observations during captivity provided detailed evidence the network. She's been incredibly helpful in identifying other prisoners who were held at the facility, Santos reported after his latest interview with Christina. Her descriptions of people she saw being brought in, taken away, have helped us identify potential victims and develop leads for additional. The task force was preparing for Operation Deep Water, coordinated strike on traffic facilities scheduled for September 15th. The operation would involve over 300 federal agents, local police officers, and immigration officials, targeting sites from Seattle to San Diego simultaneously. We'll have one chance to get this right, Vasquez warned the assembled agent. If we miss any major components of the network, they'll relocate and rebuild their operations in new territory. Agent Restrepo, who had maintained his undercover role even after the Delta facility raid, provided final intelligence about the network's leadership. The council is planning to suspend California operations temporarily while they assess the damage from Kasabian's arrest. They're moving key personnel and financial assets to facilities in Mexico and Canada. The intelligence created urgency for the federal operation. If the trafficking network successfully relocated its leadership, it could take years to rebuild the investigation and gather evidence for prosecution. Detective Santos had been assigned to coordinate with local law enforcement agents, ensuring that conventional police resources supported the federal operating security. His experience with the Christina Hall case made him uniquely qualified to understand how organized crime could infiltrate and manipulate law enforcement agencies. We're going to shut down the entire network, Santos declared during a briefing with Sacramento Police Department leadership, but it's going to require every resource we can deploy and perfect coordination between agencies. As September approached, the investigation that had begun with one missing journalist was about to culminate in the largest anti-trafficking operation in federal history. Christina Hall's courage in pursuing the truth had exposed a criminal enterprise that generated hundreds of millions through the systematic abuse, exploitation of vulnerable immigrants. The network had operated for years with impunity, protected by corruption and violence, but Kasabian's cooperation had finally provided law enforcement with the intelligence needed to dismantle the entire organization. The coordinated assault began with synchronized strikes on 47 locations, from shipping facilities in Seattle to processing centers in San Diego. Agent Vasquez coordinated the operation from the Federal Command Center in Sacramento, watching as real-time reports flowed in from assault teams positioned throughout the region. Alpha sites secured in Seattle and Portland, Agent Chen reported, through encrypted communication. Multiple arrests, no resistance encountered. Detective Santos led a local police contingent supporting the raid on a meat processing plant in Stockton, where trafficked workers had been forced to work under conditions that amounted to modern slavery. The facility appeared legitimate from the outset, but internal investigations revealed systematic abuse and wage theft affecting hundreds of immigrant workers. Federal agents, everyone on the ground, echoed through the processing plant as tactical teams secured each area methodically. Many of the workers appeared terrified, having been conditioned to view law enforcement as a threat rather than protection. "We're here to help you," Santos announced in Spanish, trying to calm workers who were cowering near industrial equipment. "You're safe now. We're going to get you proper medical attention and legal assistance." The scene was repeated at facilities throughout the region where trafficked workers had been held in conditions ranging from debt bondage to outright slavery. Many had been trafficked years earlier and had given up hope of escape, resignation evident in their faces as rescue teams attempted to explain their liberation. Agent Rodriguez coordinated the financial component of the operation, executing search warrants at banks, accounting firms. Legitimate business had been used to launder traffic. The money trail was complex, involving dozens of shell companies' offshore accounts, but Kasabian's cooperation had provided roadmaps for following the financial network. "We've seized approximately $60 million in assets so far," reported the command. Bank records show regular transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and various Central American countries. The operation's most dramatic moment occurred at a shipping facility in Long Beach, where trafficking network leaders were conducting an emergency meeting to coordinate their response to law enforcement pressure. Agent Thompson led the assault team that captured 5 counsel, including the overall coordinator, who had managed the network's operations for over a decade. Council members in custody, computers seized with communications and financial records that should provide evidence for prosecuting the entire leadership structure. By noon, Operation Deepwater had resulted in 847 arrests, the rescue of over 1,200 trafficking victims, and the seizure of facilities and assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The scope of the operation overwhelmed local jail facilities, requiring coordination with federal detention centers and immigration process. Detective Santos found himself working with victim assistance coordinators, helping to process rescued workers who spoke dozens of different languages and came from countries throughout Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. Many had been trafficked years earlier and had complex legal situations that would require months to resolve. "Some of these people have been held for 5 or 6 years," reported Maria Gonzalez, who had volunteered to help with translation and victim assistance. "They've been told their families would be killed if they tried to escape or contact authorities. The psychological impact on victims was as severe as their physical condition. Systematic abuse had left many unable to trust law enforcement or social services, requiring patient work by specialized counselors and victim advocates. Christina Hall observed the operation from the federal command where she was working with prosecutors to identify evidence and to prepare testimony for the trials that would follow. Her experience as both victim and witness provided unique insight into the network's methods, psychology. "Seeing all these people being rescued makes everything I went through worthwhile," Christina told Santos during a brief break in the coordination activity. "This is exactly what I'm trying to expose." The trafficking network had been more extensive than even federal agents had realized. Facilities ranged from legitimate businesses that exploited workers to prison-like compounds where people were held in conditions amounting to slavery. The systematic nature of the abuse was staggering, involving careful psychological manipulation designed to prevent escape, resistance. Agent Vasquez reviewed preliminary reports as the operation continued into the evening. "We've effectively dismantled the largest human trafficking network in U.S. history, but the real work is just beginning, prosecuting the leadership, assisting victims, and ensuring this infrastructure can't be rebuilt." The evidence seized during the raids filled multiple warehouses, including financial records, communications equipment, and documentation showing the systematic abuse of thousands of workers over nearly a decade. Forensic accountants would need months to trace all the financial network, while victim assistance programs would require years to help rescued workers rebuild their lives. "The prosecution phase is going to be incredibly complex," Walsh explained to the force. "We're dealing with crimes committed across multiple jurisdictions involving victims from dozens of countries, with evidence in multiple languages. But the most important immediate result was that over 1,200 people who had been held in conditions of forced labor were finally free, with access to medical care, legal assistance, and protection from the criminal organization that had exploited them." Detective Santos reflected on the investigation that had begun with Christina Hall's disappearance and evolved into the largest anti-trafficking operation in federal history. One journalist's determination to expose corruption had ultimately led to the rescue of over 1,000 trafficking victims and the dismantling of a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. As evening fell across the western United States, processing centers were still working to identify and assist rescued victims, while federal agents continued investigating leads that might reveal additional components of the trafficking network. The operation was a success. It was also a reminder of the scope of human trafficking in the United States and the sophisticated methods used by criminal organizations to exploit vulnerable populations. The interrogation room was crowded with federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and court reporters as Vincent Kasabian prepared to provide his complete confession about the trafficking network's operation. His cooperation had been instrumental in Operation Deepwater's success, but prosecutors needed detailed testimony about specific crimes to ensure convictions of the network's leadership. Mr. Kasabian, let's start with Christina Hall, Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh began, arranging case files on the table. Walk us through exactly what happened from the moment she was taken until her rescue. Kasabian glanced at his attorney before beginning, his voice carrying the clinical tone he'd maintained throughout his cooperation with federal. The Hall operation began on October 23, 1993, at approximately 11:30 p.m. at Riverside Marina. I was positioned on the cabin cruiser Second Chance, two associates, waiting for her to arrive for the meeting. Detective Santos observed from behind one-way glass, taking detailed notes. Kasabian described the kidnapping launched nearly a year. We'd been monitoring Hall's investigation 3 weeks, ever since our sources at Logistics reported that she questioned shipping man worker transportation. Her research was becoming too detailed and threatening to expose our California operation, described the actual kidnapping. Hall arrived early and was suspicious from the beginning. She didn't want to board the boat to review the documents we'd promised to show her. When we insisted, she tried to leave, but we couldn't allow her to escape with knowledge of our operation. Agent Vasquez leaned forward. How did you subdue her? Physical restraint. She fought vigorously, screaming and attempting to attract attention, but the marina was isolated and our people controlled the area. We sedated her and transported her to the Delta facility for interrogation. Kasabian's matter-of-fact description of violence against Christina was disturbing, but prosecutors needed his detailed testimony to build airtight cases against other network members. What was the purpose of holding her at the Delta facility? Intelligence gathering and threat assessment. We needed to determine how much she knew about our operation, who she'd shared information with, and whether she could be convinced to abandon her investigation. Describe the interrogation methods you used. Kasabian consulted with his attorney before continuing. Standard psychological pressure techniques, sleep deprivation through constant lighting and noise, irregular feeding schedules, temperature manipulation, isolation, except during questioning sessions. And when those methods failed to produce cooperation, we escalated to physical coercion. Hall was remarkably resistant to psychological pressure, insisting she could expose our entire network and claiming she'd prepared evidence that would be discovered if anything happened to her. Falsi aspect. Santos felt sick listening to the clinical description of Christina's torture, but he recognized that this testimony would be crucial for prosecuting the network's leadership and ensuring long prison sentences for everyone involved. How long did the physical abuse continue? Intermittently for approximately 6 months. We were attempting to break down her resistance while avoiding permanent injury that might complicate her eventual disposal. Walsh's voice was ice cold. Disposal? The plan was always to eliminate Hall once we'd extracted all useful intelligence. Her knowledge of our operations made her too dangerous to release, and her disappearance needed to appear voluntary to avoid intensive law enforcement. Why wasn't she killed earlier? Kasabian paused, seeming to recognize that his answer would demonstrate the calculating nature of the network's crimes. Hall convinced us that she'd prepared insurance evidence hidden where it would be discovered if anything happened to her. Sources who would come forward if she disappeared, automated systems that would release information if she failed to check in regularly. Were any of those claims? We never found evidence of hidden material, additional sources, despite extensive searches of her apartment and surveillance for contact. But we couldn't be certain she was lying, which meant eliminating her prematurely could trigger exactly the kind of exposure we were trying to prevent. Agent Chen interrupted. So her survival depended on convincing you she was more dangerous dead than alive. Precisely. Hall demonstrated remarkable psychological resilience and strategic thinking under extreme duress. Her ability to maintain credible threats while enduring prolonged torture was unusual. The confession continued for hours, Kasabian providing details about the network's broader operation, the systematic abuse of trafficked workers, and the corruption that had enabled the organization to operate with impunity for nearly a decade. Described the decision-making for eliminating threats to the organization. The council met monthly, review security issues, and authorize necessary action. Threats were categorized based on the level of exposure they represented and the difficulty of neutralizing them through nonviolent means. How many people were killed? Operation. Kasabian was quiet for several minutes, calculating numbers that represented systematic murder spanning multiple years. Approximately 43 individuals over the past 6 years. Law enforcement officers who got too close to our operation, journalists investigating shipping irregularities, workers who attempted to escape or contact authorities, and government officials who threatened to expose our corruption. The scope of violence was staggering, representing a criminal enterprise that had routinely used murder to maintain operational security. Christina's survival made her one of the few people who could provide first-hand testimony about the network's methods and leadership. What was the timeline for Christina Hall's? The decision was made in July 1990 when federal agents began investigating our operation. We realized her disappearance had attracted more attention than anticipated, and continued detention was becoming too risky. But you delayed the execution. I wanted to conduct final interrogation to determine whether she'd actually prepared the insurance policy claim. If evidence existed that would be released posthumously, we needed to identify and neutralize before proceeding with Walsh. That delay ultimately, the federal raid occurred 2 days before the scheduled execution. Hall's psychological tactics bought her just enough time for law enforcement to locate and rescue her. As the interrogation concluded, Kasabian had provided comprehensive testimony about the network's crimes, including detailed descriptions of murder, torture, and systematic human trafficking. His cooperation would enable prosecutors to seek life sentences for the network's leadership, while ensuring that victims received justice for years of abuse. For Detective Santos, the most important revelation was that Christina's courage and intelligence had been the keys to her survival. Her ability to maintain credible threats while enduring torture had bought the time necessary for federal agents to infiltrate and dismantle the criminal organization. The prosecution of the trafficking network's leadership began with packed courtrooms and extensive media coverage as the full scope of the criminal enterprise became public the first time. Christina Hall sat in the witness section preparing to testify about her 9 months of captivity and the systematic crimes she'd witnessed during her imprisonment. The People versus Vincent Kasabian and Associates represents the largest human trafficking prosecution in federal history, Judge Patricia Martinez announced as jury selection began. This case involves allegations of kidnapping, torture, murder, and the systematic exploitation of over 1,200 victims across multiple states. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh spent months organizing evidence and witness testimony to present a comprehensive case against 7 defendants, including the trafficking network's council members and key operational leaders. The evidence filled multiple courtrooms with financial records, surveillance recordings, and victim testimony painting a picture of sophisticated criminal organization. Detective Santos testified about the investigation that had begun with Christina's disappearance and evolved into a multi-agency operation spanning nearly a year. His account of challenges and frustrations encountered during the local investigation highlighted the network's ability to interfere with law enforcement effort. The organization had sources in multiple agencies, Santos explained to the jury. Information about our investigation was regularly leaked to criminal leadership, allowing them to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts and intimidate potential witnesses. Agent Vasquez provided testimony about the federal investigation and the undercover operation that had ultimately led to Operation Deepwater. Her account of Agent Restrepo's infiltration of the network demonstrated the risks federal agents had taken to gather evidence and locate victims. Agent Restrepo spent months in deep cover, participating in criminal activities to maintain his credibility while gathering intelligence about the network's operation. His work was instrumental in identifying facility locations and understanding the organization's command structure. But the most powerful testimony came from trafficking victims who had been rescued during Operation Deepwater. Maria Santos, who had been held in forced labor for 3 years, described conditions that amounted to modern slavery. "They told us our families would be killed if we tried to escape," Santos testified through an interpreter. "We worked 16 hours a day with little food, no medical care, constant threats of violence. Many people died from exhaustion or untreated injury." Christina's testimony was scheduled for the prosecution's final week, representing the culmination of the case against the network's leadership. Her account would provide the jury with first-hand evidence of the systematic torture and psychological abuse used to control victims. The defense strategy focused on challenging the credibility of cooperating witnesses and arguing that defendants were minor participants in a larger organization controlled by figures who had not been arrested. Kasabian's testimony was particularly damaging. His detailed knowledge of the network operations demonstrated the level of coordination and planning involved. "Mr. Kasabian, were the defendants present during discussions about eliminating threats to the organization?" Walsh, during direct examination. "Yes." "The council met monthly to review security issues and authorize necessary action." All defendant participant decisions about intimidation, kidnapping, and murder of Sabian witness seeking reduced sentence through coercion. Physical evidence and victim test corroborated his account. The evidence demonstrates systematic criminal enterprise spanning multiple years and involving hundreds of participants. These defendants weren't minor players. They were leaders who made decisions that resulted in torture, murder, and the exploitation of over 200 victims. Christina's testimony began on December 15th with careful preparation to help her manage the psychological impact of recounting her ordeal. Dr. Sarah Wong had worked with her for months to develop coping strategies for testifying about traumatic experiences. "Ms. Hall, please tell the jury about your investigation into Pacific Coast logistics and what led to your kidnapping." Walsh. Christina's voice was steady as she described her research, shipping manifests, and the discrepancies suggested systematic documents. Her account of the investigation demonstrated the thoroughness and dedication that had made her a threat to the trafficking network. "I discovered patterns of payments to shell companies, manifests that didn't match observed activities, and evidence of workers being transported without official documentation. The scope of the irregularities suggested organized criminal activity rather than simple corruption." What happened on the night of October 23, 1993? Christina described the meeting at Riverside Marina, her growing suspicion that something was wrong, and the moment she realized she'd walked into a trap. Her account of the kidnapping was detailed and devastating, providing the jury with clear evidence of premeditated abduction. "They forced me onto the boat at gunpoint, telling me that I'd been asking the wrong questions to the wrong people." Mr. Kasabian said that my investigation threatened legitimate business relations and that I needed to understand the consequences of my action. "What happened during your captivity at the Delta facility?" Christina's testimony about 9 months of imprisonment and torture was difficult for everyone in the courtroom. She described the systematic abuse designed to break her resistance and extract information about her research and sources. They used sleep deprivation, starvation, temperature manipulation, and eventually physical violence to try to force me to reveal who I'd shared information with and where I'd hidden evidence. I convinced them that my death would trigger automatic release of information that would expose their entire operation. True? No. I hadn't prepared any automated systems or hidden evidence, but I needed them to believe that killing me would be more dangerous than keeping me alive. The cross-examination was challenging. Defense attorneys attempting to suggest that Christina's memory of events might be unreliable due to trauma and the passage of time, but her detailed recollections and consistent accounts undermined attempts to discredit her testimony. Ms. Hall, isn't it possible that your captivity has affected your ability to accurately recall specific conversations and events? Defense attorney Robert Chen asked. My memory of those 9 months is extremely clear, Christina. When you're being tortured for information, you pay very close attention to everything your captors say and do. The trial continued for 6 weeks. Testimony from dozens of witnesses, presentation of thousands of documents demonstrating the scope and sophistication of the trafficking network. By the time closing arguments began, prosecutors had presented overwhelming evidence of systematic criminal enterprise involving kidnapping, torture, murder, and the exploitation of over 1,200 victims. The jury had deliberated for 3 days before reaching verdicts on the 127 charges against 7 defendants in what had become known as the Pacific Coast trafficking case. Judge Martinez called the court to order as defendants, attorneys, and prosecutors assembled for the reading of verdicts that would determine whether justice had been served for Christina Hall and over 1,200 trafficked. Has the jury reached verdicts on all charges? Judge Martinez asked the jury foreman. We have your... Christina sat in the gallery with Detective Santos and her hands clasped tightly as she prepared to learn whether her 9 months of captivity and torture would result in convictions of the people responsible for the systematic abuse. On the charge of conspiracy to commit kidnapping against defendant Vincent Kasabian, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. The verdicts continued for over an hour, with the jury finding all 7 defendants guilty on multiple charges, including kidnapping, human trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. The systematic nature of the convictions reflected the overwhelming evidence prosecutors had presented about the network's operation. Vincent Kasabian was convicted on 23 counts, including charges directly related to Christina's kidnapping and torture. His cooperation with federal authorities had helped dismantle the trafficking network, but it couldn't erase his responsibility for years of systematic violence. Council member David Wu received convictions on 19 counts, including conspiracy charges that carried potential life sentences. His role in coordinating the network's financial operation had generated hundreds of millions of dollars through the exploitation of trafficked workers. The verdicts represent justice for over 1,200 victims who suffered under this criminal organization, Walsh announced to media gathered outside the courthouse. These convictions send a clear message that human trafficking will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. Sentencing was scheduled for April, but the convictions had already a primary goal: dismantling the traffic, holding leadership accountable for crime, and providing a measure of justice for victims who suffered years of abuse. Christina spoke to reporters about the significance of the verdicts for trafficking survivors and the importance of continued vigilance against organized crime. These convictions prove that no criminal organization is too powerful or sophisticated to be brought to justice, Christina declared, but we must remember that human trafficking continues throughout the United States, and law enforcement agencies need resources and public support to identify and rescue victims. The impact of the case extended beyond the courtroom conviction. Operation Deepwater had rescued over 1,200 trafficking victims, seized hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal assets, and exposed corruption in multiple government agencies. Federal reforms were implemented to improve coordination between law enforcement agencies and strengthen protection for trafficking victims. Detective Santos had been promoted to sergeant and assigned to lead a new anti-trafficking unit within the Sacramento Police Department. His experience with the Christina Hall case made him uniquely qualified to identify and investigate organized crime operations that used legitimate businesses as cover for criminal activities. The most important lesson from this case is that individual determination can overcome systematic corruption. Trainings for local enforcement. Christina's refusal to abandon her investigation, even under torture, ultimately led to the rescue of over 1,200 people. Agent Vasquez transferred to FBI headquarters in Washington, where she worked to develop national strategy for combating human trafficking based on lessons learned from the Pacific Coast. Her experience coordinating federal, state, and local resources had demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation in complex investigation. The trafficking network operated across multiple jurisdictions using sophisticated methods to avoid detection. Vasquez explained to congressional investigators studying federal anti-trafficking efforts. Only coordinated operations involving multiple agencies can effectively combat organizations of this scale and complexity. Christina had returned to journalism, though she focused on social justice issues rather than investigative reporting. Her experience as a trafficking victim had given her unique insight into the challenges faced by survivors, and she used her platform to advocate for stronger victim protection and assistance programs. Surviving human trafficking doesn't end with rescue, Christina wrote in a series of articles about the recovery process. Victims need long-term support to rebuild their lives, including medical care, psychological counseling, legal assistance, and job training programs. The financial impact of the case was enormous, with seized assets providing funding for victim assistance programs and law enforcement training initiatives. The trafficking network's estimated $400 million in assets were redistributed to support anti-trafficking efforts and provide compensation for victims. Maria Gonzalez, whose cooperation had been crucial to the investigation's success, was granted permanent legal status and received federal protection after testifying about the network operation. Her courage in speaking out, despite threats and intimidation, had helped expose the systematic abuse of immigrant workers. People need to understand that human trafficking happens everywhere, not just in other countries. Gonzalez explained during a victim advocacy conference, "The people who exploited us looked like successful businessmen, and their operations appeared completely legitimate from the outside. The psychological impact on everyone involved in the found and last." Christina continued therapy to address trauma from her captivity, while law enforcement officers who had worked the investigation struggled with the emotional weight of what they'd witnessed and learned of trafficking. Dr. Sarah Wong established a specialized treatment program for traffic survivors, recognizing that traditional PTSD wasn't sufficient for addressing the complex trauma associated with prolonged captivity and systematic. Trafficking survivors face unique challenges in recovery because their trauma involves betrayal of trust, systematic dehumanization, and often years of psychological conditioning, Dr. Wong explained to medical professionals treating trafficking victims. As the first anniversary of Operation Deepwater approached, Christina and Detective Santos organized a memorial service for trafficking victims who hadn't survived their captivity. The ceremony honored approximately 43 people who had been murdered by the network over 6 years of operation. We remember not only the people who died, but also the dreams and future that were stolen from over 1,200 survivors, Christina said during the memorials. Their suffering was not in vain. We used these experiences to build a more just society. The Pacific Coast trafficking had become a landmark in federal prosecution of organized crime, demonstrating that sophisticated criminal networks could be dismantled, coordinated law enforcement efforts, and the courage of individual victims willing to test experiences. Christina Hall stood on the pier where her nightmare had begun exactly 2 years earlier, watching the Sacramento River flow past the marina where she'd been kidnapped and tortured for trying to expose the truth about human trafficking. The location that had once represented terror and betrayal now served as a reminder of her survival and the justice that had been achieved through her ordeal. Detective Santos joined her at the memorial had been installed to honor victims of Pacific Coast trafficking, including the 40th who had been murdered to protect the criminal organization. "Are you okay being here?" Understanding the logic returning to where Christina's captivity begun. "I needed to come back." Her voice steadied the emotional weight of the anniversary. "This place doesn't control me, and the people who hurt me are in prison, and over 200 survivors are free because of what happened." The sentencing phase of the traffic case had concluded 6 months earlier, with Vincent Kasabian receiving life without parole and other network leaders getting sentences ranging 20. Comprehensive convictions had validated the investigation and provided legal closure for victims who had suffered years of system. Agent Vasquez had driven up from Los Angeles for the anniversary commemoration, representing the federal task that had coordinated Operation Deepwater. Her work on the case had led to reforms in federal anti-trafficking efforts and improved coordination between law enforcement agencies. "The impact of this case extends far beyond the convictions we achieved," Vasquez explained during a press conference marking the anniversary. "Federal agencies have implemented new protocols for investigating organized crime, and trafficking survivors have access to improved victim assistance programs. The marina had been transformed since Christina's kidnapping, with enhanced security measures and community programs designed to prevent similar criminal activity. The boat slip where she'd been taken was now part of a victim advocacy center that provided services for trafficking survivors throughout California." Maria Gonzalez spoke at the anniversary ceremony, representing hundreds of workers who had been rescued during Operation Deepwater. Her journey from exploitation to advocacy demonstrated the resilience of trafficking survivors and the important comprehensive supports. "2 years ago, I was afraid to speak out because I thought no one would believe us or help us. Today, I work with law enforcement agents to identify trafficking operations and help other survivors find safety and justice." Christina's investigation had revealed that human trafficking was far more widespread than law enforcement agencies had realized, leading to increased funding for anti-trafficking efforts and specialized training for officers who might encounter trafficking situations. The Pacific Coast case proved that trafficking networks operate like sophisticated corporations with complex financial structures and political connections, explained Dr. Patricia Wong, who had become a leading expert on trafficking survivor recovery. "Combating these organizations requires resources and coordination that match their level of sophistication." The memorial service concluded with a moment of silence for trafficking victims who hadn't survived their captivity, followed by the release of white balloons representing hope for continued progress in anti-trafficking efforts. Christina had written a book about her experience, proceeds supporting victim assistance programs and law enforcement training initiatives. Her account of 9 months in captivity had become a resource for understanding the psychological methods used by trafficking organizations to control victims. Writing about the experience was incredibly difficult, but it was also necessary, Christina explained to reporters after the ceremony. "People need to understand that human trafficking happens in every community, often hidden behind legitimate businesses and normal-appearing operations." For Woolwick, Detective Santos had used experience to develop training programs for law and focus identifying traffic and building trust potential victims who might be afraid to cooperate. The most important lesson, Christina Hall, is that victims often appear to be willing participants in illegal activity during a law enforcement conference. Traffickers use psychological control, threats against family members, and manipulation of immigration status to prevent victims from seeking help. The financial impact of the case continued to generate resources for anti-trafficking seized assets, providing funding for victim services and law enforcement operations. The trafficking network's estimated $400 million in assets had been redistributed to support programs throughout the region. Agent Restrepo, whose undercover work had been crucial to infiltrating the trafficking network, had been promoted and assigned to lead federal anti-trafficking operation in the Southwest. His experience demonstrated the importance of long-term undercover investigations for gathering intelligence about sophisticated criminal organizations. The Pacific Coast Network operated for over a decade before we were able to penetrate their security, Restrepo explained to congressional investigators reviewing federal anti-trafficking strategies. Success required patience, careful planning, and willingness to accept significant personal. As evening approached, Christina walked alone to the end of the pier where her ordeal had begun, reflecting on the journey from victim to survivor to advocate. The terror and helplessness she'd felt 2 years earlier had been replaced by determination to prevent other people from experiencing similar suffering. The lights of Sacramento reflected on the river's surface, creating patterns that reminded Christina of the hope that had sustained her during 9 months of captivity. Her refusal to provide information that would have endangered other people had ultimately saved not only her own life, but also the lives of over 200 trafficking victims. "The people who tried to destroy me failed," Christina said quietly, speaking to the memory of her captors and the systematic evil they had represented. "Their network is dismantled, their leaders are in prison, and their victims are free." The Pacific Coast trafficking case had become a landmark in federal law enforcement, demonstrating that sophisticated criminal organizations could be defeated through coordinated effort, individual courage, and refusal to accept that some crimes were too complex to prosecute. As Christina drove away from Riverside Marina, she felt a sense of closure that had taken 2 years to achieve. The pier where her nightmare had begun would now serve as a memorial to trafficking victims and a symbol of the possibility for justice, no matter how powerful or sophisticated the criminal organization appear. The investigation that had started with one journalist's determination to expose the truth had evolved into a comprehensive effort to combat human trafficking throughout the United States. Christina's survival and the rescue of over 1,200 victims proved that individual integrity and determination could overcome systematic corruption and violence. The nightmare was over, but the work of preventing future tragedies would continue for years to come, guided by the lessons learned from Christina Hall's courage and the comprehensive justice that had been achieved through her ordeal.